Hello and welcome. My name is Mapi Bias, and I am an Access and Wellness Counselor at Ashford University. I will be the host of this session, Engaged Pedagogy, a practice for cultivating teacher self-care. Microphones will be muted for this presentation, but I encourage you to post questions and comments in the chat. Also, keep your eye on the chat for a link to a helpful session feedback survey. Now, I am pleased to introduce to you Dr. Prairie Markussen, who has been an instructor with Ashford since 2012.
Thank you so much, Mapi. I appreciate that introduction. And I'm very excited to be here and to be part of the Ashford Teaching and Learning Conference and to share with you some of my ideas about engaged pedagogy and to share with you a bit about Bell Hooks, who is sort of the founder or the originator of engaged pedagogy. So let's get started. The way I kind of like to run these types of sessions is kind of interactively. And so if you have questions as I go, please feel free to put them in the chat. I will try to keep an eye on that, although I think if my PowerPoint is open all the way, I may not be able to see it, but Mapi will keep an eye on that too. And then there will be some time at the end for questions. So again, my name is Dr. Prairie Markussen, and this session is called Engaged Pedagogy, a practice for cultivating teacher self-care. So what I'd like us to actually start by doing, we talk a lot about, when you hear about self-care, you probably hear a lot about breath work and breathing. So I'm not an expert on this, but I do find that taking a deep breath or two kind of helps to calm the system. And so I thought we would just start with taking 2 deep breaths, and then we'll kind of get into the work of the session. All right, so let's do that together now. All right. And then the first thing I would love for you to do is to do a very brief 1 to 2 minute free write. And what I'd like you to think about is how you would characterize yourself as a teacher in terms of self-care. Are you consistent with self-care, or perhaps do you neglect that part of your teacher self? Somewhere in between, what does self-care look like to you in terms of yourself as a teacher? So if you could just take a moment or two to write down some thoughts, and if time allows, we'll have some time to come back and reflect on your answers at the end. Okay, so finish up wherever you're at there. Just kind of conclude any lingering thoughts that you have. And as I said, we'll try to return to this at the end of this presentation. All right, so what I'd like to sort of start with here is a quote by Bell Hooks. And we're going to talk a little bit about who she is and her conceptualization of engaged pedagogy. But I want to start with this important quote and have us just think about that as we go forward into the presentation. So she says, when education is the practice of freedom, students are not the only ones who are asked to share or to confess. Engaged pedagogy does not seek simply to empower students. Any classroom that employs a holistic model of learning will also be a place where teachers grow and are empowered by the process. That empowerment cannot happen if we refuse to be vulnerable while encouraging students to take risks. So there's a lot going on in this quote, and I hope as we talk about engaged pedagogy today, some of this will make sense, but things to sort of be aware of at this point is this idea of a holistic model, this idea of empowerment and vulnerability. These will be sort of some of the tenets of engaged pedagogy. All right, so as you know from reading the description of today, the focus for today is to investigate what it means to care for ourselves as teachers and our students through the lens of an engaged pedagogy, as defined by Bell Hooks. And I also want us to investigate how, when teachers practice self-care, how we can acknowledge our own humanity through an engaged pedagogy. And when we do that, we're then able to offer our students truly empathetic instruction, which I think is hopefully what we are all hoping to do. So as I see it, we kind of have three goals today. And by the end of today, I'm hoping that you will leave with an understanding of what engaged pedagogy is, as defined by Bell Hooks. You will be able to do some reflection on how practicing vulnerability and self-revelation to and with your students can lead to greater empathy and a shared recognition of each other's humanity. And I hope too that you will be able to reflect on how conceptualizing your teaching practices through the lens of engaged pedagogy allows for greater self-care, which then can directly benefit our students. So these are my three objectives for today that I hope that we will meet throughout the presentation. So first, a bit about Bell Hooks, if you're unfamiliar, and this is taken directly from the Bell Hooks Institute webpage. So Bell Hooks is an acclaimed intellectual, feminist theorist, cultural critic, artist, and writer. She has authored over 36 books and has published works that span several genres, including cultural criticism, personal memoirs, poetry collections, and children's books. Her writings cover topics of gender, race, class, spirituality, teaching, and the significance of media in contemporary culture. So she has a wide range of topics that she sort of addresses, and I love that because when she talks about engaged pedagogy, she kind of is coming to it from these different vantage points. And incidentally, if you aren't familiar with why she doesn't capitalize her names, it's because she wanted the attention to be focused on her work and her words and what she was saying rather than her name, rather than the big name. So just as sort of a side note. So what is engaged pedagogy? So this is taken from her book, Teaching to Transgress. And as she envisions it, it sort of has four pieces, and there are other pieces to it, but I'll talk about four main pieces today. So Hooks's engaged pedagogy requires teachers to view both themselves and their students as holistic beings, to be vulnerable in front of students and do the work that they are asking of students, to work toward their own self-actualization, and to emphasize well-being. So these are kind of the cornerstones of engaged pedagogy. And some of these, just upon seeing them might seem a little bit lofty or a little bit abstract. My goal today is to try to give some concrete examples of how these elements, these aspects of engaged pedagogy could be brought into our classrooms in actual, real, specific ways. That's my hope today. And I also am interested in hearing, hopefully maybe at the end, how you all could see how these can be used in your own classrooms in concrete ways. So let's take a look at the first one, holistic beings. I think this one sometimes is maybe the loftiest and sometimes kind of the most difficult to understand how it can apply to our classroom spaces. So when students enter, or teachers step into the classroom space, we are not suddenly divorced from the rest of our lives. It might feel like we are, but we actually are not. We still carry with us everything from the rest of our lives into that space. And so Bell Hooks is talking about how we want to not divorce ourselves from all the rest of the parts of our being. We are not robots. We live complex lives inside and outside of the classroom space. We have bodies that get sick or experience anxiety or are tired, and we have unexpected events that occur that are truly beyond our control. And of course, in our time now, in the time of COVID-19, this is more true than ever. And so what Hooks is encouraging through an engaged pedagogy is for teachers not to compartmentalize their own lives or the lives of our students. And I don't know if this has been something that you all have done before, but I certainly have done it, especially as an earlier teacher, earlier in my career. I often thought that the moment I stepped into that classroom space, whether that was a face-to-face classroom or whether that was an online classroom, that I had to sort of be a different part of myself or be a different version of myself, that I couldn't be affected or influenced by anything outside of that classroom space that might have been going on in my life that day. And so Hooks is saying this is not what we want to be doing. We do not want to compartmentalize our lives and say, this is my teacher self, this is my parent self, this is my worker self, and so on. That all of these things are connected in this holistic way. Okay, so how do we bring that, or how could we bring that into the classroom space? So one of the things that I have done, and certainly could be a decent strategy for dealing with this particular element of engaged pedagogy, is to include a teaching philosophy in our syllabi, or as an announcement that acknowledges the multifaceted nature of our students' lives. We could certainly do this in other ways too. We could record a video, we could record an audio, we could put it even in our profile section that we have for all of our accolades and the things that we have done. But I think it's a good space too for a teaching philosophy that acknowledges that students are not robots, that students are multifaceted, that we are also multifaceted. And if anyone is interested in seeing my specific teaching philosophy, afterward, please just let me know. I'm happy to share it and to show you kind of how I've articulated this. I think another thing, especially during this time, during COVID, is to be lenient in terms of due dates, especially now. And I think the reason for that is because we ourselves might be affected by COVID. Well, we're all affected by COVID on one level or another, but we might be ill or know somebody else who is ill. Our students certainly are experiencing challenges with COVID. And I think, yes, we work on a 5-week, it's a very quick 5-week kind of structure. So it's burdensome sometimes for us as teachers to have to accept late work and catch up on that. However, if we really want to acknowledge our students as holistic beings, as having these multiple parts to themselves, which includes being parents and being workers and whatever outside of the class, then I think the leniency is called for in this case. And to honor that holisticness of them, I think this is called for. This last one is a little bit more abstract, but I think the idea is that we want to shift our thinking and remind ourselves that our own lives outside of being teachers and students impact how we enter the classroom space and how we interact with fellow students and how students interact with me and how we react. You know, I have gotten, I'm sure this has been the case for some of you, where if you put a 0 into the grade book for a student because they didn't quite do the assignment correctly, but you're giving them another chance, a lot of times I'll get a very reactive email from a student saying, why'd you give me a 0? That's uncalled for. That's not cool, whatever they say. And I'll have to say, well, did you read what I actually said in your feedback? And then they read it and they apologize and da 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 da. That reactivity may not have anything to do with me or the class. It probably has a lot to do with all these other parts that are influencing how they enter the classroom space. And so I think it's good for us to remind ourselves of that fact. Seems maybe a little bit like a no-brainer, but it is something I have often forgotten as a teacher across the many years, that that my students have lives, that they have all these other things that they're doing outside of this space. Okay, vulnerability. So what does this mean? So Hooks encourages teachers to practice being vulnerable in the classroom and being wholly present in mind, body, spirit. And again, that might seem a little bit lofty, but that sort of trio there relates to what I was talking about in terms of holistic beings, to acknowledge that we are not just mind when we enter the space of the classroom. We are also body, we are also spirit, whatever that means to you. And in speaking of the empowerment of teachers in the classroom space, Hooks says that empowerment cannot happen if we refuse to be vulnerable while encouraging students to take risks. So this should look a little familiar because this is the quote I asked you guys to reflect on and kind of think about in the beginning of this presentation. So this idea that we assign assignments to our students that we would be unwilling to do ourselves, or we ask students to be open and honest and vulnerable about their ideas and their thoughts and their own personal experiences when we don't take that same risk with our students. And Hooks would say that that's not a fair balance and that needs to change. The teacher needs to come to the students with an attitude of vulnerability. So what does this mean, though, actually in the classroom space, or what can this mean? So I don't know what your different fields of study are. For me, I teach writing and I teach literature. And so one of the things that we can do in order to practice this vulnerability is to share our own work. So for me, what that means is I've shared my writing, my personal writing, as it has evolved over time. So I have shown students my work from undergraduate through my different graduate degrees to show them how I didn't arrive fully formed at this moment being a perfect writer, that it has taken me, and I'm still not a perfect writer, but it has taken me these many years and these many steps to for my writing to evolve, right? And so I share my own writing, I share my revisions. I think this is particularly helpful for students to see the multiple revisions that something might have to go through in order to be submittable, right? To be polished enough to be submittable. So I share those with my students. I share my mistakes because it's important for students to see that in their teacher, as well as because they're sharing their mistakes, whether they know it or not, right? They send us something, they submit something, and for me, I say, you know, this is the grammar's wrong here, or this doesn't work. So they're sharing their mistakes and they're forced to be vulnerable in that way. I think it's also really important for us to tell our own educational narratives, our struggles and our successes. And again, that's something we can do in our profile section. That's something we can do in an announcement, however you think you want to do that. And for me, again, being a teacher of writing, for me, that means maybe sharing my literacy narrative. You know, what has influenced me along the way in terms of my reading and writing? What has impacted me? What has been challenging? Who has helped me along the way? We often ask our students in writing classes to share their narrative. And I think sometimes they don't always realize, or we don't always realize how raw that can be for our students. Yeah, you know, tell me about your experience with writing and like all the times that you felt ashamed because you couldn't write well or something. You know, it's like we ask this of our students. We need to give it back to them as well. And then, do we have struggles with language? Yes, even as a writing teacher, I still struggle between things like who and whom, okay? That's something I'm always gonna struggle with. And I think it's important to share that with the students. When the students are getting all this feedback that they have comma splices and run-on sentences and fragments, to come to them and say, I get it because these are the things that I struggle with as well. These are the things that I am still dealing with. And then be honest about what we don't know and be open to learning from our students. Again, these might seem a little bit basic, kind of no-brainers, but I will say for myself, as an earlier teacher, I was not honest about what I didn't know. I just pretended I knew whatever the students were talking about. And that does not benefit them, and it certainly didn't benefit me to pretend that I had some sort of knowledge that I didn't have. So I think it's important to be open to learning from our students and to realizing that yes, they actually do have they have valuable things to teach us as well as we have to teach them. Okay, I'm kind of keeping an eye on the chat, so I'm seeing your comments. Okay, so the last one, I'm kind of putting these two together, self-actualization and well-being. So what does this mean? And we may have heard of this in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but self-actualization refers to when a person is able to achieve or reach their fullest potential mentally, spiritually, physically. And that might ring true for when I talked about mind, body, spirit. So that trio again, mentally, spiritually, physically. And so Maslow's hierarchy of needs places self-actualization at the top, right? It's the last step of achievement in order to lead a fulfilled and fulfilling life. We have to meet all these other levels before we can kind of reach towards self-actualization. So Hooks is asking, I think, a lot of us in her discussion of self-actualization. I mean, she's asking us to reach, to achieve these other levels in order to be self-actualized, to even begin to work on that piece. But she says that an engaged pedagogy emphasizes well-being. That means that teachers must be actively committed to a process of self-actualization that promotes their own well-being if they are to teach in a manner that empowers students. So you can start to see this pattern in what she's saying to us. And what she is saying is that we cannot meet our students where they are. We cannot help our students. We cannot help our students to succeed unless we ourselves are caring for our own well-being, unless we ourselves are reaching towards this place of self-actualization, which is tough. And so I will say this, that my strategies for the classroom for this one are much more abstract, I must say, and a little bit less specific. So I would be very curious to hear you, if you guys have feedback at the end about what kind of concrete things we could do in the classroom to practice this type of self-care for ourselves, right? To reach for self-actualization, to reach for well-being. So these are more things to contemplate. These are more things for us just to mull over. So we can practice asking ourselves multiple times along the way, in what ways am I reaching for this self-actualization? How am I trying to live my most fulfilled and fulfilling life, right? And we must also challenge ourselves, I think, to see the connection between life practices, habits of being, and the roles of professors. So this is what Hooke says, that again, this speaks to the holistic beings that I talked about earlier, that we cannot divorce our role as professors from our life practices, from our habits of being, because all of these things are intertwined. And again, this is kind of lofty, and I'm sure you've heard this language a lot, but we can practice being compassionate toward ourselves and making a space for our hobbies, interests, and goals. And then the next step, though, is to share that with our students, to share those hobbies, interests, and goals with our students. And again, I think we begin to do that in our profile section, right, where we share a little bit about ourselves. But I think if we can do it more mindfully and more intentionally, with the purpose of showing our students that we are reaching toward this, we're reaching toward more, we're reaching toward a higher level up for ourselves, and we're hoping to learn more, right? I think that striving, like showing students that we are striving in the same way or similar ways that they are, can create sort of this parallel experience then between teacher and students. Okay, so those are kind of the tenets of engaged pedagogy. Those are some strategies for the classroom. And so I want to talk just briefly about then how can we develop self-care practices through this engaged pedagogy. And so I have a few ideas here. So I think one of the important things to do is to share personal stories that relate to coursework, or just to make a connection with students. And so I will share with you one of the things that I've grown comfortable sharing this with students is, when students talk to me about having anxiety or having depression or having some kind of mental health struggle, I also share with them my own mental health struggles. And for me, that's comfortable enough. Obviously you share what you want to share to a point, to the point of wherever you feel comfortable. But for me, I feel comfortable sharing that with my students, and I feel like that creates a greater empathy between us and a greater understanding, that they're not just coming to me and saying, I'm a mess, I'm having this struggle. And I'm just saying, oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. Bummer. So I feel comfortable though saying, well, I have also had these struggles, and let me tell you a little bit about that. I think, and this might be debatable for some of you, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I really stress avoiding presenting a professor persona that only reveals a polished, put together, and successful version of yourself. And there's kind of two reasons for this. I think sometimes students can feel like there's such a divide between where they are and this like professor persona, fake whatever person that the professor is presenting, that I think it can be demotivating. And by the way, I'm not saying that being polished and being put together and being successful is demotivating. I'm not saying that we shouldn't present our best selves, but I just think that it's important for us to be real with our students. And sometimes that persona, that sage on the stage kind of persona, can be problematic for students. And then I think it can be problematic for us as well. I think sometimes, I'll speak for myself, I have often felt kind of earlier in my career fake, or like I was pretending in front of my students, and I felt like I wasn't being myself. I felt like I was really denying the rest of me, the parts of me that didn't know all the answers, and the parts of me that wasn't always so put together and polished. So I think this professor persona can be detrimental sometimes. I think we can also share how we are learning difficult concepts, how we learned them before and how we might still be learning them. I think this is a kind of self-care for ourselves, because we are acknowledging that we are still works in progress in terms of our knowledge. And then that parallels, again, what the students are going through. And I think if we can encourage our students and ourselves, right, to see, and this might be a no-brainer again, but to see all knowledge building as a process, as ongoing, and as a practice. And we are meeting these students at one specific moment in their lives for 5 brief weeks, right? And so if we can just understand that they're not gonna be able to do everything in these 5 weeks that they will eventually be able to do, if we can see this as ongoing, I think that's really important. And if we can extend the same compassion and empathy we give our students to ourselves, which of course is sort of very challenging, but if we can do that, then that's a good thing, which means we allow for errors and we allow for mistakes. And if we can try to nurture our own lives away from the classroom and then learn new things so that we are always in a position of student alongside our own students. I think these are some of the ways that we can kind of cultivate the self-care and that will directly benefit the student. Okay, so I know we only have a few minutes left, but I just want to do this one brief thing so that you actually can put something into practice here. I would like you just to think about what we've talked about now and think about how you could apply some element of engaged pedagogy to your current courses. So maybe just think of one course, what course are you teaching, and what element, whether it's holistic beings, vulnerability, self-actualization, or well-being, could you bring to that course? And what concrete way could you actually bring it to your course? What concrete way could you actually practice and engage pedagogy? So let's just take a moment or two, and then I will open the chat area and just see kind of what you guys are sharing here. And we can talk a little bit about that. Okay, and it looks like I've been given the 1 minute heads up. So I apologize that we didn't have more time for questions. I really meant to allow that space for more questions. But maybe if you have any lingering questions now, we can address those.
Dr. Markussen, there is a question in the chat from Michael Robinson. What is your point of view on mindfulness practice as an educator? I know you had mentioned not compartmentalizing, but.
So I, just as I was a little hesitant to sort of do the breath work at the beginning, because I don't feel like I have a lot of, credentials as far as sort of mindfulness or these sorts of things or meditation or whatever. I have been hesitant to sort of bring mindfulness practice into my classroom in a real concrete way or in a real consistent way, because of that, because I'm not super versed in those particular things. But can you say a little bit more about what you mean in terms of, it seems like you're differentiating sort of mindfulness practice from compartmentalizing, or not differentiating, but you're setting those as sort of opposites in a way. So maybe if we have time, if you could say a little bit more about that. Other questions? Great. Yeah, that's great. Bonita, that's so sharing daily time management skills. Wonderful. Yeah. Oh, I see. Okay, I got it, Michael. Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, where you're just in the moment, you're not thinking of before or after. Yeah, that is a really interesting, I guess I never thought about how that could be seen kind of as compartmentalizing. So that's, you gave me something to think about there. That's really interesting.